Hey, it's Drew. I'm excited that you're here to listen to another episode of Renegade Marketers Unite. And if this is your first time listening, then welcome. This show is brought to you by CMO Huddles, the only marketing community dedicated to inspiring B2B greatness and that has a logo featuring penguins. Wait, what? Yeah, well, a group of these curious, adaptable, and problem solving birds is called a huddle. And the B2B marketers and CMO huddles are all that and more, huddling together to heat up the coldest job in the C suite. And now that CMO Huddles has 3 membership tiers, we're ready to inspire B2B greatness at all levels. To learn more, check out cmohuddles.com. Now, before we get to the episode, here's a shout out to the professionals at Share Your Genius. We started working with them over a year ago to make this show even better and have been blown away by their strategic and executional prowess. If you're thinking about starting a podcast or want to turbocharge your current show, be sure to talk to Rachel Downey at shareyourgenius.com and tell her Drew sent you. Okay, let's get on with today's episode. Hello, Renegade Marketers. Welcome to Renegade Marketers Unite, the top-rated podcast for B2B CMOs and other marketing-obsessed individuals. You're about to listen to a recording of CMO Huddle Studio, our live show featuring the CMOs of CMO Huddles, a community that's sharing, caring, and daring each other to greatness every day of the week. This time, we've got a conversation with Huddler's Bernd, who was CMO of Mimecast at the time of this recording and is now at Cornerstone OnDemand, and Jamie Gier, currently the CMO of DexCare. This was all about the ultimate guide to board management. I know you're going to get a lot out of it, so let's dive in. Hi there, I am your host, Drew Neiser, live from my home studio in New York City. One of the more nuanced challenges of being a CMO is that every quarter or so, you can find yourself presenting to a group of individuals known as the board or board of directors. The level of involvement of boards in general and individual board members in specific varies wildly. As a CMO, these meetings are fraught with danger. Often there is no one on these boards who has any marketing experience. Believe it or not, less than 20% of boards have representation from marketing. So their actual understanding of how marketing works can be very limited. Or just as challenging, the board could have an experienced CMO on it who may want to be overly involved in your business. So either way, for many CMOs, being in front of their board is the most nerve-wracking part of their jobs. So on this show, we're going to speak with 2 superstar CMOs, Bernd and Jamie Gier, both of whom have presented to multiple boards and lived to tell about it. Ironically, we were supposed to have a third guest, Paige O'Neill, but she got called into a board planning meeting with her CEO, and so it goes. With that, let's bring in Bernd, CMO of Memecast and star of episode 10 of this show. Wow. So, Bernd, how are you?
I'm doing great, Drew. How are you?
I'm great. So, we did a little digging into your LinkedIn profile and saw that you published 2 books in 1996 and 1998 to help German students interning or studying in America. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, thanks, Drew. Way to age me right away coming on the call. Yeah, so I'm originally from Germany. When I was in Germany, I had lived in the US as a kid and came back for college. And after having gone through that whole application process, I felt like, wow, this is really hard. And I wanted to make it very easy for other German students not to go through the same pains that I went through. So I wrote about my experience, basically guidebooks, how to go through the application process. And I have to say, like, regardless of all the work I've done as a CMO in my entire career, like for me, like those emails that came back in from students saying, thank you, that your book was a blessing. Because of you, I was able to get into my dream university. That felt good. And it's always something I can look back on.
Have you ever been tempted to go update those? Or, I mean, because it's an amazing story and what talking about an act of generosity.
Yeah, actually, my initial idea was actually, I was thinking about making that into a career. I was thinking I could create a whole company with that idea, but that quickly turned into hey, let's go down the traditional path of creating a career that actually pays a little more money. But it was fulfilling, and I really enjoy the helping people out. I have two kids, one in college right now, one in high school as a senior. So at least I can help out a little bit in that regard and help them get into the dream school of their choosing.
There you go. Well, that's amazing. And to have gotten 2 books out of the way that early in one's career. Okay. Well, we're focused on boards, and let's just sort of set the stage in terms of your interactions with the boards at your current board.
Yeah, it's interesting. So, Mimecast were an email security provider, and there's been a little bit of a transition. Like when I came into Mimecast, we were a publicly traded company, so we were dealing with a board that was very diverse, all different typical board that represents a publicly traded company. We were acquired by a private equity firm called Premier in May of this year. So the board configuration has changed significantly. Now, the majority of the board is the seats are taken by Premier members. So it's been interesting, like looking at the two different dynamics of the two, but equally, they've both been very rewarding. I think the board members, regardless if it was the previous board as a publicly traded company or now the Premier board, have been very, very supportive and helpful in our journey. And I have to say, it's been a very pleasant experience overall.
Well, let's talk about the differences for a second, because I think that's so interesting. So, a public board, there's such a thing as board insurance. They have a certain, I don't know, is it fiduciary responsibility as a board member to make sure that the company operates by certain standards, which I imagine is a little bit different from a PE firm where it's just grow, grow, grow to flip, flip, flip. Right. It's a little bit the board may be coming at it differently. So I'm just curious if you go back first and let's just start with how did you approach the public board and what were the kinds of things that you found sort of they were interested in and they resonated? Get set the stage on the public part of this.
Yeah, I think regardless if it's like the private or the public setting, I think the key is and the interests are very much always the same, which is like what are the business initiatives? What are the key strategic drivers that are relevant for the organization? And so I think the key as a marketer is like how do you tie yourself to those core initiatives and how do you talk to that? I think you made a really good observation, which is a lot of the times the board members do not have a marketing background. I think that was very much the case in the earlier stage. So I think you have to really be able to connect at the right level with the board and you have to be able to talk their language, not your language. They're not in your day to day. They don't really understand your day to day. So you have to be able to up level your conversation to a degree where it resonates and they can relate to that much more easily. And that's been the case. I think now in the private equity firm, there is obviously a lot more detailed knowledge of an organization and how an organization runs. So they do care, not that they care more about operational metrics, I think they all do, but they're able to relate much more closely to your world and they have much more pointed questions maybe than the previous board did.
And so I'm going to go back to the public board. So I'm imagining a situation where you have former people who ran companies. You had they're like legal or accountants or business leaders, right? They typically that's what a board structure is. And they're interested in revenue growth. And we know as marketers, the holy grail is to be able to tie marketing spend to revenue, but it's a lot harder. I mean, we've been looking in CMO huddles for predictive engines and that kind of thing. And I got to say, there's a handful of huddlers who have a really true predictive engine, right? Where they can spend a dollar and get 5x out. So, how do you say, well, we're spending money? What are the euphemisms that you use or the language that you use that get them close to get to here's what marketing means in terms of revenue?
Yeah, I think kind of what I mentioned earlier, you have to tie it back to the company outcomes and the goal. So if there's a certain expectation around the overall growth projections for the company, ideally you want to be able to tie your activities to that. So in our case, it might be our pipeline targets. We've talked about in the past through about brand building. There is an element around brand building as well, and how ultimately that is the umbrella and the air cover for what ultimately will turn into revenue downstream. So if you're able to bring your metrics up to a top level that relates to the overall growth metrics of an organization, that's the language I think that resonates, that is much more easily understood.
Well, I'm gonna just call out brand building as an example of one of those where you could get eye rolling. How do you make brand building sort of relevant to a board? I mean, did you have any success with where you're talking about Mimecast as in we're here, we need to be here, and we're measuring brand this way, or frame it for us so that And someone who's about to go to talk to a board and they know that brand is a problem, how do they express it in a way that the board will understand?
Yeah, and this is at Mimecast and also in past companies. I actually have one board member. It's funny enough. I was making a business case for investing more in our brand building efforts with our CFO, and it so happened I was in the board meeting. We were talking about brand building, and one of our board members, who was a CEO of a company at the time, basically said, "Wow, you really need to invest more in your brand efforts. That might cost significant amount of money for you to do that." But it was basically making a business case for me that I could take back to management to say, like, well, you heard it from the board. They strongly believe that we have to make a stronger investment in brand building. So that was almost a nice little layup T-ball, so to speak, for me to go back to the management team and say, like, well, you heard from the board. So it sounds like that's something we should take a
Yeah,
strong.
well, that's like an ideal scenario, right? Where the board is saying, "You're
Right.
underinvesting," and I just can't imagine that happens every time. So that is an outcome that I would describe as a really good outcome. Are there any other sort of, we'll call it best outcome where you met with the board and something really good came out of it?
I think one of the questions as a management team you should discuss beforehand: what is the goal of the board meeting? What are you trying to accomplish? Is it an update? Is it something that you're actually looking for feedback on? So part of that is going in with a mindset of, like, am I informing? Am I educating? Am I trying to learn? Am I trying to network? Am I trying to obtain connections that I might not be able to obtain myself? And a lot of the board members are very, very well connected in their organizations and throughout their network. So good outcomes for me have been being able to ask specific questions around, do you know somebody in this domain? Or what do you think about this? Could you connect me with somebody in your organization around this? Do you know anybody who could help me with this topic? So those have always been really, really good outcomes. I think in general, as a marketeer, if you walk out of a meeting and no harm done, that's always a good outcome. If you don't get any massive follow-up questions, I think if you come in, you make a good presentation, you connect your goals, what you're doing, to the goals of the company, and you get good feedback on that, I would say that's always a win.
I'm going to share a story that came up in a huddle with one of our CMOs. And they tell the story. It was the first board meeting that they went to where they presented all these wonderful marketing metrics. And they were just great. Everything is up versus last year and versus goal. And so one of the board members says, "So you're hitting all your marketing metrics, but sales isn't hitting its numbers. So is sales screwing up?"
That would be a tough one. That's actually a really good point. You also want to make sure you're really, really well aligned with the rest of the team and the entire team that's presenting. That story has to be cohesive. You have to go in as one team with one unified front. You can't be speaking out of turn, or you can't be like not complimenting each other in regards to the story that you're trying to convey. And I would also say, like, it's not always about presenting everything in rosy terms. Very often, what I think the boards are looking for is reflection. They're looking for what's working well, what's not working well, and what's your plan to address the issues that you might have surfaced. They're looking for thoughtfulness. They're looking for resolutions and for plans. I think that's the most important thing that I've like observed. And I think that goes back also even engaging internally with your own management team. It's not always about making everything look good. It's about making sure that issues you identify are being thoughtfully addressed and thoughtfully planned for. That's been a key lesson in my career.
Have you witnessed a board meeting disaster or heard of one that you can share?
I can. I wasn't in this board meeting myself. I was in one of my previous companies. So board meeting, usually the night before the board meeting, the board has dinner with the leadership team. And in that evening, bread was not broken. And the next day, when the board meeting happened, the CEO was actually asked to step out for a couple hours. And the board meeting went on without the CEO in the room, and ultimately led to a change in management. So I think that was quite dramatic for a board meeting. Again, I wasn't part of it, and that was pretty dramatic.
Yeah, that's an outcome that certainly for the CEO would not be a good one. One of the things that came up in a huddle the other day, which I thought was so good, was the framework that the board is there for the most part to be helpful. And even if they're not marketers, their goal is to be helpful. So you always want to go to a board meeting with an ask. And I thought that was really interesting advice. And you mentioned a couple of asks about connections and things. Has there ever been an ask that you've done that was just that worked out really well that you've had? And or can you follow up on it?
If you have specific areas you want to learn more about, for example, product-led growth, or it might be a better understanding of like some of the tech stack. So it could be different topics you have interest in that I've asked for support or for help. It might be go-to-market strategies on expansions into new countries where some of the board members had relationships in the past, or they in their own companies they've gone through expansion plans like that. So those are areas where I've had asked and had quite helpful responses in getting support from the board and helping out. What I've also done is I've asked for like specific follow-up meetings with individual board members. And what I've found in my career is that my CEOs have encouraged that as well. So that's been quite helpful, just having one-on-one time as a follow-up to like discussions that happen in the board meeting where you said like, I'd love to explore a little bit further. We might not have time right now in the board meeting, but would you have time to spend like another half hour with me on a certain topic? Point that I made earlier around the brand building, the board member who was a strong advocate around brand building, I had asked him, would you mind speaking with me for half an hour about what you did in your organization around brand building? And he said, I'd be happy to. And he's an extremely busy person. He was a CEO of a publicly traded company. And he took the time and he basically talked to me exactly on who they used, which company they had used, and how they went about it, and how that had helped his company to make a major advancements on their brand building efforts. And that led to ultimately me engaging with the same organization that he had used. That was a beginning for a brand journey that we undertook in one of the companies that I had worked for. So that was quite helpful. That was one of the asks that I remember most dearly that led to a really positive outcome.
That's a great story, and particularly since the individual brought up brand and brought up and so demonstrated an expertise, and I'm thinking as this as a strategy, if there is a CMO on the board, a former CMO on the board, and by the way, for you CMOs listening to this, the biggest complaint about CMOs when they join the board is they think they're still the CMO of the company they're the board of, and so they get into the weeds, they get all up in the business of the CMO, and that's not what they're there for. However, I was thinking that based on what you just said, if the CMO says to that board member, not they could do it for any of them, but specifically, hey, I'd love to sit down with you and just talk about your approach to marketing. So that person can lay out the way they think, right? Their framework, their mindset, their success stories. Because just as you did in that case of taking that half an hour, you now know, okay, this is what they're familiar with. This is how they approach this. If I want to solve this problem and get board approval and I take this path, I've got one vote for sure.
I think in general, the mindset you should have going into board meetings, the board members are there to help and to support you. They're not there to grill you. They're really there to help you and to support you. So they love to share their experience. They love to help and provide feedback and input. And if you are willing to open yourself up and be a little bit vulnerable and tap into that, I think the rewards can be quite substantive. So I would encourage you certainly, again, within reason, like you also want to make sure like whatever you're doing as you're discussing with the board, you've kind of vetted with your CEO and that you're aligned with the overall story. But if you have a CEO who's open to that and who's supportive and you have certain topics that you want to go deeper, again, that can be a double-edged sword. You certainly don't want to open up Pandora's box and you don't want to like air all the dirty laundry. But if there's certain areas you're looking for feedback on and for help on, and you're willing to tap into that, I've seen throughout my career, the board members have always been more than willing to help out and lend a hand and make those connections or provide their input or their feedback.
So interesting. And I agree wholeheartedly that as a board member, I've been on a board of a nonprofit for a long, long time, and the board is there to be helpful. They really want to do, but I hadn't thought about getting the CEO's approval before you reached out. And so that's important because I can imagine in some cases the CEO may not want you to have those relationships for whatever reason. Not necessarily, it could just be their own paranoia about the board. All right, we're going to bring on Jamie Gier. This was the CMO of Saros, star of episodes 22 and 40 of this show. One of my favorite posts of yours on LinkedIn is a reflection on running track with a photo of you as a child wearing red running shoes, which you compared to red ruby slippers. Talk a little bit about the lessons you thought about for our listeners and viewers.
Sure. So first, I grew up with a father who was a coach. He was a football coach. He was a track coach. We were running track since the age of 5. And last spring, my son took up track as well as part of conditioning for football. And as I was in the stands watching the runners, it occurred to me that even those who were coming in 5th, 6th place, their teammates were cheering them on. They were at the finish line and they were high-fiving each other. There's just this high degree of encouragement. And it wasn't so much about which place they would come into. It really was around, were they setting new personal records? And so placement was irrelevant. They were trying to beat their own personal records for track. But it was very touching to see not just their teammates, but their competitors cheering them on for that reason. And I remember when I was running track at 5, 6, 7, I wasn't the fastest runner at all, but I felt that I was setting records for myself, but it contributed to the team.
Love it. Okay. Well, speaking of contributing to the team, I know that you have both from Dreambox and Saros dealt with boards, interacted with boards. Talk about your sort of basic approach or how it evolved based on as you got more and more experience with managing boards.
So I always started with, what is the purpose of the board and how can they serve me, but how can I serve them as well? And you touched on this a little bit earlier, which is they're there to help govern, but also to help approve bigger decisions that you're making on behalf of the company, bigger strategic decisions. And you want to make sure that you're giving them the insights and information that they need, not just about the performance of marketing, but some of the signals that you're picking up in the marketplace that can just help with those two functions that they serve. So, anytime that I've worked with a board, I've led with, what is their purpose? How can I serve them? How can they serve me? And I want to be very respectful of the limited time that they have because they have other portfolio companies that they're working with. And so it really becomes, how do I become a strategic advisor to them and make sure that I'm using them in the appropriate way?
And in both Dreambox and Saros, those were PE or VC funded boards.
Sometimes they're a combination, but the majority owner was a private equity.
Okay. I'm curious. I want to dive into that because PE firms, again, depending on the PE firm, have a lot of portfolio companies. And when they do have a lot of portfolio companies, they have sort of normative ideas that, well, this is how much you should spend, this is how you should spend it. And I'm curious if in your interactions, how you sort of navigated through the generalized, well, these are the things that have worked for other companies versus the specifics that you had to deal with it at those 2 companies.
I've been pretty fortunate, Drew, that the private equity firms I've worked with provide a really good balance between guiding versus instructing. And they're very good about understanding the uniqueness of each of their companies that they oversee and that they govern. Now, when that has come up, I'm receptive to the information, but I'm very well prepared to talk about my own company, about our own marketing function, our buyers. And in some cases, I leverage that input as a great follow up because they might get me connected to another portfolio company where I can learn and understand. And in other cases, I can guide them as to why we're doing things the way that we are.
So, talk about it. Bernd shared a story while you were off camera about how he did a one-on-one with one of the board members, and that helped really shape how they did a big brand initiative that worked well. What's the best outcome you've had in a board meeting, or at least a story that sort of there was a challenge and you were able to work with the board to make something happen?
The one that comes to mind is when I needed to come in mid year. So, budget's already been set. We know what our spend levels are supposed to be. But I was joining the company mid year. I did an assessment of some additional investments we needed to make if we were going to hit our targets and grow, and put together an ROI on those investments, working very closely with our CFO. This happened to be investments in product marketing, so people, in addition to some additional technologies that we needed to better understand our customers and to be able to target them. And I came prepared with a business case. And what board of directors care about in PE firms is what is the cost and what is the yield? And if you come prepared with a pretty sound methodology for how you prepare a business case, it makes it easier to get them to improve the investments that you're trying to make. So in this case, I was able to link product marketing with an increase in win rates, when that return would show, and what it would even have in terms of impact on renewal rates or retention rates. And in doing that, and by the way, I timestamped that in terms of we should be able to see a return on that investment within 1 year. But look what we're going to get in years 2, years 3. Because I understood the data and the fact that they run by cost and return, it made it easier for me to secure those investments. And fortunately, they were the right ones in terms of headcount and in technology.
And I'm curious because I mentioned this to Bernd, the sort of the holy grail of this whole universe of marketing is being able to go to a board and say, we're going to spend X on marketing all in, and we're going to get 5X in revenue all out, right? And that's sort of this magic number. And if you could talk in those terms, but something like a product marketing, which is the technology and people, how were you able to craft that, like actually show data? And if there wasn't a product marketing function, I mean, and what formulas, where did these formulas come from?
You know what? I worked with the CFO to come up with one because one did not exist.
Okay.
I reached out to my peers, my communities, and everyone just kind of scratched their head and said, I don't even have that. So this is where I partnered with my CFO to say, this investment, let's just say it yields a 1% increase in win rate. That's substantial. In the first year, it covered the cost of salary. But then you got to look at the value, the lifetime value of that customer.
Right.
If you were to get that win, and then it makes it an easier conversation.
I want to see that formula again.
I'd be happy to share it.
Now that I hear it, I mean, we're only talking about an incremental improvement that could have a really significant return. So it wasn't a big investment, and the return was based on a rational percentage increase, which is a lot different than saying all this money for marketing and this 5X return in revenue. That's a much harder series of events to link.
It is a much more difficult series to link. But I started conservative.
Yeah.
1%.
Yeah, this was the
2%.
conservative. Right.
Yeah.
I love it. Okay, that makes total sense. So that was the best case. Have you witnessed or heard of a really bad, awkward board conversation?
Oh, yes. And this gets back to how you prepare for the board meeting in the first place. So what I do, Drew, is I make sure that ahead of the board meeting, I understand what the company narrative is. And that is largely led by the CFO or the COO. And I plug into it. But I also make sure, as I'm pulling data for my own function, I'm working with every client-facing team, from the CRO to the client success officer. Maybe it's owned by the same person. And I make sure that our data and our story is aligned, because these board of directors are very well equipped to look at data on page 5 and understand the data on page 62. So if they're not aligned, if they're not synced, and you have discrepancies, it's a very awkward, embarrassing conversation to have. So it's all about preparation and making sure that you have a good alignment with all of the executives and the data that they're pulling.
So what I'm inferring here, reading into this, is there was a moment that you heard of or witnessed where the data didn't align. And
exactly.
And that created a moment of, because in some sense, that's a gotcha moment. And there are some people who are there to get you. And that's the unfortunate thing, that that individual or person was looking for that discrepancy. See, I pay attention. That's probably someone with a very detailed finance background who found that. And that's unfortunate, because I hate stories like that, because they may have missed the big picture.
Right.
and they're just focused on the weeds there for a second, or it could have been a big picture outcome. Okay. And so I guess lastly on this subject for you, at least in the short term before we get back, has there been a circumstance where a board member was really helpful to you?
Many examples of that. And it starts with your relationship with the board is not just the quarterly meeting. So I make sure that I have a monthly meeting set up, mostly with the operational leader. And that way, there's no surprises when the quarterly meeting actually happens. But they become a trust partner to me where I can take some of the thorny issues, bring it to them and say, look, I don't have this figured out. So can we ideate together or can you put me in touch with another portfolio company? And I think that they appreciate that very much because then you're at least honest about what you don't know or something you might be struggling with. And it's not a hit to your reputation or anything like that. You simply haven't figured something out, and that's what they're there to help. So there was a case where I was really struggling with a specific vertical and trying to understand how to think about the nuances of that business. And that board member was able to sync me with another portfolio company that was in that space. And so I connected and I was able to get some of the knowledge that I was lacking to really think through. But that gets back to, especially if you are owned by a PE firm, that they have other portfolio companies that you should be tapping into to seek input and learn and bring back to your own company.
Yeah, that's perfect. Okay, what a great moment for us to transition from me to talk about CMO huddles because the story that Jamie just shared is all about finding peers who can help you solve problems that you're facing. And so, CMO huddles. Launched in 2020, CMO Huddles is an exclusive community of over 100 highly effective B2B CMOs who share, care, and dare each other to greatness. Everything about CMO Huddles is designed to be a force multiplier, helping you to make faster, better, and more informed decisions. Where one inspiring an hour a month delivers 10 hours of perspiration saved, or maybe gets you a better experience with your board. Now, since no CMO can outwork their job, CMO Huddles is here to help you outsmart it. So, Bernd, Jamie, I'm wondering if there's a specific example, because I love the example that Jamie, you just shared about how this board member connected you with another CMO who had solved a problem. But I'm wondering if you can, off the top of your head, remember a circumstance within huddles that where you were able to solve a problem in a special way. Jamie.
I don't know if there was a specific problem as much as it helped me think about something differently. And there's been a number of people within CMO huddles that I've been able to just dial up and say, hey, it sounds like you're really good in this one area, or you are looking at a particular technology that I'm interested in, or maybe you went through a recent implementation. Can you share with me in a private setting the good, the bad, the ugly on that? And a lot of people within CMO huddles is on my speed dial. And that's a very nice thing to have. And everyone is really responsive. They want to help. And we know that we haven't figured everything out as CMOs. And so when you are surrounded by a group of people that maybe have, and you can call them up even on a short notice, they're there to help and assist.
I love it. Well, thank you for that. Yeah. And one of the things that we do in huddles is we do connect one-on-ones based on a problem that you might have that we know a CMO in the community has solved. Bern, I wonder, not to force the issue, but anything
Yeah, yeah.
you want to
Happy,
share?
happy to share. I think kind of to Jamie's point, if it's the board is one asset that you could tap into for like networking and they can put you in touch with the portfolio. For me, CMO Huddles has been vastly helpful in regards to we all share the same challenges, the environment, the economy, like we all talked about COVID and how we were dealing with that as leaders in our teams. So I have a specific example. I think we, as marketeers, we often struggle with attribution. And so the opportunity in both like these forums that we have where we get together and we pick a specific topic that we can talk through. But to Jamie's point, also having the opportunity to talk one-on-one with peers who are experts in those areas. And I've had multiple calls with other CMOs around attribution and how they do it and how they measure, and talked about lead scoring as another key topic that I was very interested in. And there's just so much expertise in this group that you can tap into. And vice versa. I think it's also about giving back and then like sharing your experience when other people have questions that you might have expertise in. So it's this give and take. It's a really good collaborative group that allows us really to Jamie's point, be smarter, to share best practices, and to come up better in a safe environment where you can ask these questions here in this environment versus like sometimes you don't want to go to your CEO. You don't want to go to people within your own company. Yes, we're all vulnerable and we can accept that we don't know everything, but you also want to pick an environment where it's a little bit safer to ask these questions.
Yeah, that circle of trust is just so important. Well, thank you both for that. If you're a B2B CMO who can share, care, and dare with the best of them, be sure to check out cmohuddles.com. Okay, so let's get back to the topic at hand. We talked around this, but talk about how you craft the narrative to show the strategic nature of marketing. Because so much, and this is the perception of marketing among non-marketers, is often very fluffy. Oh, you're the brand thing and the logo and the colors and the fluffy thing. I know we should be well beyond that, and maybe we are, but how do you craft a narrative to show the strategic nature of marketing before each board meeting? And let's go with Bernd.
Sure. Well, in my domain, so as part of the portfolio that I own, a group that is called Market Strategy. So we're very much involved in looking at new market openings, segmentation. So for me, it's very much like kind of what we talked about earlier, tying it back to the company goals and not making it just about one topic that might be pertinent to me, but like tying it back to the organization. So it might be we're looking at new markets, we're looking at segments, we're looking at certain strategic initiatives we're looking for help and feedback on. So being part of that conversation and making sure that I'm very much involved in that process internally, but then also making sure that I contribute to that conversation at the board level kind of changes the dynamic and not being seen as the logo person or the brand person, and making sure like you're actually being seen for that real contribution that you can make to the organization.
Yeah, you're the business person who happens to do marketing, not the marketing person who is accidentally on the board. Got it. Okay. And Jamie, any thoughts on that?
I have lots of thoughts on that in particular. But this is why it's really important, board meeting aside, is that CMOs connect marketing to the business. They also train their teams to think about being a business owner. So it's having the business in financial acumen so you understand what matters most and how marketing supports the bigger business initiatives. The other thing is we amass a lot of information from the work that we do. There's a lot of intent signals out there that are actually leading indicators about what's going on in the marketplace. And so not only do we need to infuse that in the narrative, but we need to be prepared to talk about what are the future trends that we're seeing. Because a lot of the times the meetings just focus on the lagging indicators. We're looking at performance based on a moment in time. But because of the information that we're collecting on our buyers and the signals that we're seeing, there's a gold mine of information in that we can extract the intelligence, show leading indicators so that we can have a future perspective and avoid having to course correct too much. And that way we're becoming a strategic input mechanism into the conversation instead of just reporting out the metrics from marketing. But it really does begin with connecting what we do to the business, training your teams to think that way too. Because, by the way, they're very good at extracting intelligence. And so we need to be able to take that and pull it into the narrative as well.
What I love about the combination of what the two of you said is you're really positioning the CMO and as really, and I know I've heard Linda Boss from GE talk about this. You are potentially the strategic, forward thinking aspect of the business. And I really want to emphasize that the board is that opportunity to show that. If they're there to govern and shepherd the business forward, and you're the one bringing that it really changes the way they think about marketing as this transactional thing that drives leads to a business driver that can drive strategy and future results. But I want to get specific though on that when we talk about intent signals and metrics that sort of get you on this future forward looking thing. What are we talking about? What data points are we actually looking at, Jamie? I mean, I understand it 10 as it such as it is based on someone going to a pricing page versus someone asking for a demo. I understand intent signals from that, but that's really detailed. I'm just wondering what you would share that would show that would able to be able to talk about intent signals, but I guess not like this. We had this many clicks on demos.
Right. And by the way, they don't really care about that. They
Mhm.
do care about you're contributing to pipeline,
Right.
that marketing is having an impact on actually closed won, that we're learning why there's closed loss, but they don't care about necessarily how many clicks you're getting. They do care about the channels that are working well, but this is where we can up level the conversation. So what I mean by leading indicators is when you look at the pipeline you're building, are you seeing shifts in the types of companies that are engaging most with you? Are you seeing some new buyers, for example? Do you know what their interest was coming in? So, are there certain trends that they're looking at that they're attaching to your brand, problems you're trying to solve? So, there's things that we can look at that got them to want to engage with us in the first place. Are you getting more business from enterprise than SMB? Is the average deal size increasing? If so, why? There's a lot of different things that we can evaluate and slice and dice the information to see if that provides any insights on what future buyer might be, how long they're going to stay with us. Are there certain markets that we're testing that could prove to be very valuable in terms of market share? So there's a lot of things that we can bring based on what we know about the buyer because the technology is there and it's giving us the insights. It's just being very intentional about looking at that and extracting out that kind of intelligence that we can bring back.
Yeah. So 2 thoughts come to mind. One is, boy, you better have a great data person, which we always know you always need anyway. But 2, part of the art of this is only sharing enough metrics because one of the complaints of CMOs is they share too much, which is an interesting one. So you do have to sort of do that. But I know, Bernd, I saw you making notes and so forth. You wanted
Yeah.
to weigh in here, so go
No,
for it.
I couldn't agree more with Jamie. I think the key is what the board cares most about is predictability, right? And so I think the opportunity that we have is we have those early insights and those intent signals that we can deliver to provide that predictability. It might be that you built out an entire model around how much pipeline do you have to deliver in the next year or two, and those are early indicators that will provide signals on the success of the company moving forward. I think the other thing that we can provide as marketeers is we can represent the voice of the customer. Like very often I've done like primary research, or in my team, we own the customer advisory board. So we have an opportunity to engage with our customers in a way, not just to learn about what our customers care about, but in a way I use the cab to learn more about what do their peers care about as well. So those are like ways that we can tap into research and knowledge of our buyers, as Jamie said, that nobody else has to the degree that we have. And so that's something that we can bring to the table that provides additional insight and additional information that either the sales team doesn't have or the board certainly doesn't have. And I would also caution, and you mentioned this, Drew, as well, don't come to the board meeting with vanity metrics. Like they don't care about a lot of the things that you use on a daily basis in your domain, and like they're important for your team and they're important for your organization and for the team members within marketing, but they're not critical to the board and they're not critical to reflecting on the overall success of the organization. So you have to make sure that you're able to connect the relevant metrics. And Jamie mentioned a few of those, like your pipeline targets, your win-loss analysis, your segmentation analysis. Those are the things that are more meaningful for the predictability of the success of where the company is heading.
Yeah, I'm imagining a couple things. I'm going to be repetitive here, but first, your sort of big picture strategy. You're on it. You're owning it. You're seeing it. Giving them forward looking data. The sort of next level down is being the voice of the customer. I mean, I always joke about this, but it is so true. Any sentence that starts with "I was talking to a customer the other day" is a winning sentence for a CMO, particularly in front of a board. And then I'm also thinking that you have to bring them along, and in order to not overwhelm them, you don't want to start with 20 metrics because they just can't grasp those. So it might be that you start with a smaller number and then you grow and educate them over time so that they know how to deal with that. And I think we've gotten some really good ones here in terms of pipeline and win rates and so forth.
Can I say one thing along those lines, Drew,
Sure, please.
that the two of you have actually touched on related to the customer? I've gone into the habit of before going into a board meeting, there's three things I do besides collecting all the data. I talk to a handful of customers to see if they have any feedback on the data I'm collecting and if they have any additional insights. I try to go into the communities where they are. And then along the lines of the value of CMO huddles, a lot of the times I'll go to our own community. If I know I'm going to get asked a question about what I'm seeing in terms of the latest in digital marketing or what's the perspective on in person or virtual events and the impact, I try to think ahead of questions they're going to ask. And I will go to the communities that can help address that so that I have like fresh, relevant information.
Yeah. There's a lot of preparation is what I'm hearing if you really wanna do well in this. So, we're recording this at a moment where more than half the huddlers are looking at budget cuts in 2023, probably more than half now, and yet the business goals haven't necessarily changed. And I'm wondering how these conversations are gonna go with the board under those circumstances. And what's the CMO going to say when you want to talk about pipeline and coverage and you're looking at a 25% reduction in spending, but a 25% growth in cover? How are these conversations going to work? Maybe you're not facing them, but Jamie, what advice do you have for CMOs under these circumstances right now, particularly facing budget cuts and then going to a board meeting?
My advice is to work with your board so that they understand that even if buyers are not purchasing today, they're going to get back to purchasing. So you need to be top of mind. You cannot take the gas pedal off your own visibility and making sure that when they are ready to get back to buying, which is probably what's driving the reduction in budgets right now, because there's a lot of market uncertainty and what's going to happen. But marketing is also the long view. We're not just living in the quarter. We are the ones securing future business. And so you need to be prepared to have the conversation. This is why it's important that when you're building the relationship with the board, you're providing the leading indicators for what the future trends are, because it's going to make it easier for you to make a business case as to why you should not deprioritize marketing and make the cuts to the very thing that's going to secure your future growth.
So I'm going to throw this. I hear you, but I'm also imagining that the CFO and the CEO have agreed that they have to cut the budget because they're seeing softening in deal flow, right? And so they're not going to want you to go to the board and undermine them because we've already talked about alignment. The scenario that I'm imagining and I'm playing that in some of the CMOs and huddles are going, help. I'm now in this sort of I've got to be Svengali. I'm going to have to do some magical thinking is happening. And I don't know if a board would say, "Hey, the budget's been cut. How are you going to hit your numbers?" And you're going to say, "I don't know either." I mean, what, Jamie, go ahead.
Yeah, well, okay, just like I said earlier, when you go to secure investments and you do the cost and the yield, then you need to be prepared to do the opposite. If
Yeah.
you cut, what is the impact going to be? And as CMOs, we should be ready to talk about that because
Yeah.
we know we have the data that tells us, because it's that prescriptive, that if we cut in this area, we're going to see the impact. And if we cut in this area, we're going to see the impact. And if we cut in this area, we're going to see the impact. And if we cut in this area, we're going to see the impact. And if we cut in this area, we're going to see the impact. And if we cut in this area, we're going to see the impact. And if we cut in this area, we're going to see the impact. And if we cut in this area, we're going to see the impact. And if we cut in this area, we're going to see the impact. And if we cut in this area, we're going to see the impact. And if we cut in this area, we're going to see the impact. And if we cut in this area, we're going to see the impact. And if we cut in this area, we're going to see the impact. And if we cut in this area, we're going to see the impact. And if we cut in this area, we're going to see the impact. And if we cut in this area, we're going to see the impact. And if we cut in this area, we're going to see the impact. And if we cut in this area, we're going to see the impact. And if we cut in this area, we're going to This is what it's going to do to pipeline. This is what it might do to customer service. It might have an impact on innovation. And everyone needs to agree that that's okay, that the business can actually absorb some of those losses because we're going to cut. So you just have to be prepared.
Yeah, Drew, I would add, I think in these times, there's certainly a shift in many organizations that is happening where maybe the emphasis isn't as much on the growth, it's much more on the profitability. So I think it's on us as marketeers as well to do our part. And I think part of that is to demonstrate that we have a good understanding of the operational efficiency of our own organizations as well as everybody else's. And so what that means is that we have to be at the top of our game with our telemetry to say, like, here are the things that are working really well. I want to double down on these areas. And here's some areas that are not working as well that I might cut back on. And most likely, you're not going to go to a board meeting with not being aligned with your CFO or your CEO. Those conversations already happened beforehand. So
Yeah.
the business case you have to make is within your own team before you go to the board meeting to say, like, look, here's what I'm seeing. Here's what I'm seeing in my environment. We're being asked to contribute X amount of pipeline. Here's what's working well. Here's what's not working well. And then that is a trade-off conversation with other sources of pipeline or other sources of growth or other sources of success. And I think that's the conversation you have to be ready to have
Right.
with all the telemetry at your own disposal. So to your point, I think it's really critical that you're at the top of your game in understanding how is your business doing, how much you're contributing to the business, and where is that coming from, and where is it working well, and where is it not working well.
And what we're seeing in this unfolding economic challenge or the horizon is that the long-term spending, the things that you were talking about, Jamie, where, where we're going to be talking about top of mind awareness and lead flow on top of the funnel are going to be sacrificed for short-term maintaining target numbers. And so I just wonder as we sort of wrap things up, your hand is going to be forced, right? You're going to have to make some compromise. And the question is, how honest can you be with the board in that? Because in theory, you know what pipeline you can contribute based on what you've been doing. So how honest are you saying, well, this probably won't hurt for 6 months or 12 months, but it'll probably impact it in 18.
I think you need to be transparent. You can't just always paint the rosy picture of what you're doing. You have to bring those thorny issues to the table. But this is a moment where CMOs can really demonstrate that they're not only looking at their functional area, they have to be a business owner. That's got to be their mindset. And they have to be prepared to make some of the trade offs. And to Bernd's point, this means having an understanding of the operations of the business and being forthcoming that, yeah, we could cut here. This is the impact. So let's readjust if everyone's comfortable and being very transparent about that. But I encourage our CMO community to take their marketing hat off, put on their business hat, and they're going to have to make some painful decisions. It's the hard thing about hard things.
Exactly.
And Drew,
Exactly. Well,
one additional comment there real quick is, like, I think as we're recalibrating around the success metrics is also recalibrating what is good and what does success look like, so that we're tied again. Like, if we need to recalibrate and we need to adjust our budgets or investments, well, great. Like, what are we adjusting to and what are the outcomes we're trying to drive? So if there's an adjustment overall of those metrics, as long as we're still aligned as an organization and as long as we're tied, that could be fine. We just need to make sure that if the goals are the same, but the investments are different and the expectation set is just do more with less, then that needs to be a conversation as well. So I think it's just about realigning
right.
expectations and outcomes.
Yeah, and I think that's the important thing is and there is going to be some where you can do some squeezing, where you probably can take 20% and maybe still hit your numbers, but if the cut's more than that. So we have to define, and I love this. Okay, so here's my wrap up really quick, which we never do on this show, but we're gonna do it because this was so insightful, and thank you, Jamie and Bernd, for this. You are a strategic leader of the organization. When you go to the board, you are not just the marketing person. So you're framing everything in terms of that. You're giving them information that helps them understand and predict the way the business is going. We get to this term predictive a lot more now as we talk about board conversations, but we're also talking just about marketing in general. You are the voice of the customer. That's always been a thing. And then you have the data to back you up. I love how Jamie's preparation process of customers and community and asking peers, and also just Bernd's. If the cuts get too deep, and we're resetting expectations. And if the goal is EBITDA, then we're just going to recognize that this is what good looks like moving forward. Anyway, thank you, Bernd, Jamie. You're both good sports. To hear more conversations like this one and submit your own questions while we're live, join us on the next CMO Huddle Studio. We stream to my LinkedIn profile, that's Drew Neiser, every other week. Renegade Marketers Unite is written and directed by Drew Neiser. Hey, that's me. The show is produced by Melissa Caffrey, Laura Parkin, and our B2B podcast partner, Share Your Genius. The music is by the amazing Burns twins, and the intro voiceover is Linda Cornelius. To find the transcripts of all episodes, suggest future guests, or learn more about B2B branding, CMO huddles, or my CMO coaching service, check out renegade.com. I'm your host, Drew Neiser, and until next time, keep those Renegade thinking caps on and strong.